Just a disclaimer before we get started, the manga and by extension, this video, cover potentially uncomfortable topics like suicide and a certain contemporary political figure. Moreover, since this manga is only one volume long, the imagery I use for this video is from the entire manga, although I do my best to discuss it as spoiler-free as I can. But with that out the way, let's begin. Mujirushi, the Sign of Dreams, is an interesting outlier from Naoki Urasawa's bibliography. Whereas the majority of the works he became well known for were long-running serializations, Mujirushi was a simple one-volume long story that he made in collaboration with the Louvre Museum in Paris. And for someone who built his whole career from writing longer stories, some of you might be wondering, how did his attempt at a very short serialization go? And there's quite a lot to unpack here. In this review, I'll first give a brief rundown of the manga synopsis, and then go over what I liked about the manga, and what I didn't. If you're not familiar with Mujirushi, it is a 9-chapter long manga that follows this young girl named Kasumi as her father, a factory owner named Takashi Kamoda, finds himself in massive debt after getting caught for tax fraud and for losing copious amounts of money from producing masks based off of controversial and insane billionaire American presidential candidate Beverly Duncan. With their situation getting desperate, Kasumi's mother leaves the family without ever saying a word to head on a cruise to feel like a billionaire, just like presidential candidate Beverly Duncan. And all the while, Kasumi's father begins contemplating suicide, seeing no path forward. Just when they get to their lowest moment, they get contacted by this mysterious crow who leads them to this French society. There, they meet this mysterious buck-toothed Francophile man calling himself the Director, who wants Kamoda and Kasumi to flee to Paris and steal a painting from the Louvre, that painting being none other than The Lace Maker by Johannes Vermeer. Now to get into what I liked about the manga, namely its key ideas and how it fits in with Urasawa's bibliography as a result of said ideas. Even in just 9 chapters, the story manages to convey a lot of interesting ideas and themes that you often see throughout Urasawa's other works as well, and fairly well for that matter. If you've never read an Urasawa work before, Mujirushi can give you a brief but good taste for elements typical of his stories. And for people who have read his other works, Mujirushi is thematically like a spiritual successor to Billy Bat, which was already arguably Urasawa's most introspective and personal work from his entire bibliography. But more than just being a spiritual successor to Billy Bat, it also feels like a bit of a precursor to Asadora, which Urasawa had as an idea for a manga several years before he actually started writing it. And I suppose that is fitting. After all, he outright wrote Mujirushi right in between Billy Bat and Asadora, but it truly does feel like a thematic mix of both series. Of said prevalent key ideas that Mujirushi tackles, I wanted to center in on 4 particularly, those being the value of family, the value of humanity, the value of art, and the value of dreams. Let's start off with discussing family. Family is a major focus of Mujirushi, as it is for almost every other Urasawa work, a result of Urasawa's own troubled childhood with him being raised by his grandparents due to his parents constantly fighting. I suspect that it's because of his upbringing that his works have almost always strongly emphasized the importance of family. Parent-child relationships in particular are a pretty significant component of Yaora, 20th Century Boys, Pluto, as well as Asadora. And Mujirushi offers yet another exploration of these sorts of parent-child relationships, though through a study of a much more dysfunctional family than we see in Urasawa's other stories. In Mujirushi, we start off following a family wherein we have the deadbeat dad, the absentee mom, and the observant and hopeful protagonist daughter. Later in the manga, we also run into another family. An adoptive family, that is. It's pretty interesting to look at the two of them in contrast to one another, especially since Urasawa doesn't try to depict an adoptive family as any less legitimate than a biological one. If anything, the biological family we follow during the story is far more pathetic. So while Urasawa wrote Asadora after Mujirushi, I think you'll come to appreciate some of the preliminary familial ideas he had for Asadora on display in Mujirushi if you've already read some of Asadora. Now, let's talk about Mujirushi's exploration of humanity, which I already somewhat alluded to at the start of the video. Naoki Urasawa, in a number of ways, is almost like Osamu Tezuka's successor, the man many know as the god of manga. Urasawa has gone on record multiple times to talk about how much Tezuka had inspired him, and how reading Phoenix completely changed his life. And Tezuka's works are known for this pervasive sense of humanism, or otherwise, the belief in the sanctity of all lives and the equality of all people. After all, Tezuka grew up during World War II, and when he was a young man working as a doctor in a hospital, he was once punched in the face by an American troop stationed in Japan. And that experience really got him thinking, why do human beings fight one another? What's the point? How can people who are effectively identical in biochemical composition go to war? Why? This experience is ultimately what led him into making Astro Boy, a story effectively about racism, xenophobia, and discrimination in general. Naoki Urasawa followed suit in a number of his stories, and not just in Pluto, which was his reimagining of the greatest robot on Earth from Astro Boy. Anti-immigrant discrimination and racism are pervasive topics throughout multiple stories in Master Keaton, and you see them rear their heads a fair bit in Billy Bat as well, being a story following a Japanese-American comic artist, and then in its second half, an African-American comic artist. Even putting discrimination aside, several of Urasawa's works also dive into the general sanctity of life as well, such as Monster, a work whose ultimate thesis is that all lives are of equal value and that all lives are equally worth saving. Now, you may be wondering, where does Mujirushi tie into all of this? It does so in two ways. First is through the lens of perceiving the value of an individual life in the most dire of straits. With Kamada and Kasumi being in heavy debt and on the verge of complete destitute, it does feel fairly reminiscent to Happy and the Umino family situation with how they're also in debt to a bunch of Yakuza loan sharks. And in both stories, Urasawa is incredibly adamant about the importance of resilience, perseverance, and persistence. But this time around in Mujirushi, you don't have a go-getter like Miyuki desperately trying to put food on the table, but rather an absolute idiot of a deadbeat dad who's contemplating suicide. Though much like Urasawa's previous works, Mujirushi is very adamant that all lives are precious and that there's always a path forward, even under the most dire and desperate of circumstances. If you like something like Monster, you might find this aspect of Mujirushi compelling too. Both are very anti-nihilist in nature. But the second way Mujirushi ties into this idea of the value of humanity is something that's quite amusing, but also not as explicit. I briefly alluded to this earlier when going over the story's basic synopsis, but the story poses the question, what would happen if you were to have a scandalous American presidential candidate who wanted to build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it? Someone who would seemingly believe that some people's lives were worth less than other people's lives. Does that sound familiar at all? For a good while, and for obvious reasons, Urasawa was a little afraid of Mujirushi getting an official English release. And in interviews, he would often comment that there was no intended similarity between Beverly Duncan and any real-life figure. But honestly, I don't buy it for a second. I just think he's trying not to get sued. It should be pretty obvious who Beverly Duncan is supposed to be based off of, and anti-Duncan sentiments as well as pro-humanity sentiments are pretty substantial in Mujirushi, though without as much of a clear-cut thesis as you normally see with Urasawa's other works like Monster or Pluto. So while he depicts the general absurdity of said political figure and the 2016 US presidential election, what he's trying to say with his depiction of Beverly Duncan can be left open to interpretation. Nonetheless, this was a pretty ballsy move and one of the most interesting parts of Mujirushi. Honestly, I think it's even more ballsy than what Urasawa and Nagasaki did in Billy Bat with the fake Chuck and Walt Disney, simply because Mujirushi's commentary is based on a contemporary figure rather than a deceased one. Now, beyond exploring the value of humanity, Mujirushi more predominantly explores the value and power of art, as is evident by it being a collaboration project with the Louvre and with the story itself also revolving around the Louvre and the lace maker. In some ways, Mujirushi thus feels like a spiritual successor to Billy Bat, which Urasawa wrote immediately before Mujirushi. Ultimately, both stories are almost entirely centered around the value and potentially life-altering nature of art, especially in the way that it can unite pretty much anybody, irrespective of other superficial differences. But Billy Bat focused on this more from the perspective of an artist, whereas Mujirushi does so more from the perspective of an art consumer. And with such a limited runtime, I think it does a pretty good job of establishing art's power. If you're a fan of Billy Bat, I think you'll like this aspect of Mujirushi. Conversely, if you like this aspect of Mujirushi but you haven't read Billy Bat yet, I'd strongly recommend giving that a go, since it covers this topic, but in much more depth. Speaking of Billy Bat, that leads us into the fourth one of Mujirushi's key ideas, the value of dreams. Mujirushi's localized title is Mujirushi, the Sign of Dreams, which should make this idea's prevalence in the story incredibly self-evident even before actually reading it. And as the title would imply, the story makes use of a symbol or sign to represent dreams, which of course is pretty reminiscent to both the likes of 20th Century Boys and Billy Bat. Much like both of these aforementioned stories, the recurrence of said sign is a strong part of the overall mystery of Mujirushi. But as mentioned before, this sign represents dreams, and dreams as well as the way that art can tie into said dreams are pretty big focal points of Mujirushi, much like they are for Billy Bat. Walt Disney's alleged motto was that if you can dream it, you can do it. And Billy Bat tries to portray its own little spin on said message, while also effectively calling Walt Disney a complete hack. Its message is more along the lines of, if you have something you really, really wish for, from the bottom of your heart, you can make it happen. Mujirushi has a similar sort of message, that only the dreams you desire will come true, only the dreams you truly, truly wish for from the bottom of your heart. So at its core, Mujirushi, too, is fundamentally a story about dreams. All in all, Mujirushi is a manga with a lot of interesting ideas, and it definitely has the spirit of most of Urasawa's other works. Nonetheless, there were still a number of things about this manga that I did not like. Now, in the span of only 9 chapters, Mujirushi doesn't have the depth that you'd come to expect from Urasawa's other works, which are significantly longer. Even the likes of Pineapple Army and Pluto, which are 2 of his shorter serializations, were ultimately a good 8 volumes long. And while I don't think Mujirushi needed that much time to tell its story, I think it definitely could have benefited from being at least 2 or 3 volumes long. Overall, the plot's okay, but nothing particularly special, especially for Urasawa standards. And while the characters are alright and they move the plot forward well enough, they're nowhere near as compelling as what we've seen from Urasawa's characters and many of his other stories. And although Urasawa has a knack for making super compelling side characters, in the span of only a chapter or 2, I didn't end up seeing that in Mujirushi. I suppose that Mujirushi's overall story being so short to begin with didn't give it room for a lot of characterization, so that makes sense. I suppose one funny little upside to the characters is the presence of the director, who is actually Iami from Osomatsu-kun, or at the very least, an interesting reinterpretation of him. But of course, the way I view it, a fictional work's plot and characters are entirely secondary to its message. So far more important than for characterization, the main reason I wish the manga was a little bit longer was so it could flesh out its commentary to a point that it'd be saying something more than what Urasawa's previous works have, or something a little bit more profound than what he usually says. Like, you do see family in a bit of a different way than you see from Urasawa in his other works, but there's so little that you get to see in the first place that it doesn't end up feeling all that meaningful. It just ends up feeling too similar to many of his other works without having as much to make it stand out within his overarching bibliography. The one thing that does make it a little bit more unique is its commentary on the absurdity of the 2016 US presidential election and at least one of said candidates from it. but it is not explicit enough to really get what it's truly trying to say about it. Though alas, being a collaboration project, I think the intent was always for Mujirushi to just be a one-volume long serialization. If you're looking for a shorter manga to read, this is quite possibly one that you might find interesting if you're looking for Urasawa-esque social commentary. If you have never read a manga by Naoki Urasawa before, I suppose this could be a little bit of a primer for what to be used to when reading a work of his. But to be honest, I would personally recommend reading another one of his stories for your first experience with Urasawa, simply because I think the overwhelming majority of his stories are much better than Mujirushi. And with Mujirushi especially, you'd get a little bit more value out of it when considering it in the context of his larger bibliography, especially since it's what he wrote right in between Billy Bat and Asadora. But of course, even if you don't end up liking it all that much, it is just one volume long, so there's not much to really lose. I'd say check it out if you haven't already. If you have read it, let me know your overall thoughts on the manga. But with that in mind, have an awesome day, everyone.